And thank you very much for that, Sean. You mentioned a couple of times 3 different key groups of actors: regulators, regulated institutions, and the RegTech firms. We've got now a small but perfectly formed panel bringing all 3 actors absolutely together. So I'm going to hand over to Ghela Boskovich to chair the next session and introduce the panel. Thanks very much, Ghela.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, especially having had that really fantastic overview from Sean about the RegTech landscape. What's really quite interesting is that I had a chance to read the report, and the notion that collaboration between actual RegTech firms and the supervisors, the authorities, are really what showcase the potential of RegTech. But before we begin, and before I introduce this panel, I want to remind you all to submit questions via the Q&A function that's at the bottom of the screen. We'll have some time after we've had this orchestrated panel discussion to answer your particular questions. And I see that some have actually been submitted already. So thank you very much. But now let's get to the important people in this discussion. First and foremost, we have Sam Woods, who happens to be the Deputy Governor for the Prudential Regulation firm and is the CEO of the Prudential Regulation Authority. He's also a member of the Bank of England's Court of Directors, the PRA Board, and a board member of the Financial Conduct Authority. Before that, he served as a senior member of HM Treasury and joined the Bank of England back in 2013. So has a long history of looking at the macroeconomic perspective of what the economy looks like and ensuring that the regulatory and compliance framework is fit for purpose. So welcome to Sam. Thanks for joining us today. We also have from another regulator, from the Financial Conduct Authority, Sheldon Mills, who happens to be the Executive Director of Consumers and Competition. But before joining the FCA, where he also, by the way, served in the capacity of the interim Executive Director of Strategy and Competition, Sheldon led the delivery of UK merger control across the entire economy as a Senior Director at the Competitions and Market Authority before joining the FCA in 2018. Thank you very much, Sheldon. Looking forward to hearing your perspective on some of the use cases and some of the practical application of RegTech and how the FCA is facilitating its growth and adoption. We also are joined by Joanne Smith from the entrepreneurial side. She is the founder and executive chair of TCC, which is a compliance, it was founded 20 years ago to change the compliance landscape. It's still going strong, having actually won the title Best RegTech Company of 2021, a little bit earlier this year. And she also founded RecordSure, which is a firm that helps institutions meet their transparency requirement and also improves accountability in order to protect the end customer. Joanne also happens to be a passionate investor in female-led tech companies, and she is an active advocate for the small and medium enterprise community. So thank you, Joanne, for joining us and giving us a real insight into the challenges of building and promoting and getting traction and adoption of an actual RegTech firm. And we're also joined by Adriana Ina, who happens to lead public policy, in fact, for Europe and the UK at Credit Suisse. The institutional perspective is what Adriana brings, and she has vast experience across the investment space, including stints at Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch, where she managed government security products. Her current work, though, as Credit Suisse leverages her expertise in all things regulatory policy and issues covering things digital, innovative, anything related to digital innovation, in fact. And she focuses on cybersecurity, data, and of course, RegTech and RegTech adoption. Now, in context of the report that was shared earlier, and what you'll actually get to dive down into detail, is that new tech adoption really isn't at all easy for big institutions. And we've seen evidence of that in the lengthy runway that FinTech has had in order to increase its own adoption, from its nascent start back 20 years ago to much more collaborative approach as of today. But RegTech is still very nascent, and it suffers from the same sort of internal, external barriers to adoption. What we really are already aware of the fact that for big institutions, there are long procurement cycles, there's a lack of buyer education and awareness, and there's certainly extraordinary difficulty in navigating some of those internal decision-making processes within the institution and also getting executive sponsorship. Most of all, there are constraints that are posed by legacy technology and a lack of available budget. But there are also some external pressures that RegTech is facing and trying to overcome those hurdles, like a hesitancy for regulators to promote RegTech solutions in order to maintain their tech neutrality stance. Sean mentioned that earlier, and I think that's one of the things that we're going to be discussing in detail today is what can regulators do to increase awareness, but also advocate for the adoption of technology, being vendor neutral and solution neutral, but technology positive. The other thing that we're going to be exploring is a lack of data standards and interoperability. And that's something that any ecosystem is always going to be challenged by. That's, I think, with coordinated approach, that can be overcome, and we'll discuss that. And then there's the second part of the real ecosystem challenge, which is a lack of digitally enabled regulatory framework. That's something that Treasury is definitely addressing this year in its upcoming legislation, framing out, for example, the policy landscape review. The FCA is certainly addressing this in context of the open finance consultation that they closed last year. And a lot of what is being prepared in terms of the framework landscape will certainly enable adoption. But again, let's go back to those challenges that we're facing for RegTech. So my first question really is for Sam, and thank you, Sam, for joining us today. The PRA is really recognized as a leader in using innovative technology to better achieve its objectives. And they've actually engaged in work with some of the private institutions on digital regulatory reporting. But my primary question to you is, how can the PRA be even more visible and transparent in its attempts to use such technology and to advocate for such technology like cloud and supervisory technology? How can they lead by example? Can you give us an idea of what you're planning for the PRA in taking us forward and making that, overcoming that particular hurdle?
Great, thanks, Ghela, and thanks also to Catherine and Sian. I think it was Catherine who said this was a perfectly formed panel, and she must have been referring to the other members of the panel, because I confess I'm distinctly out of shape. I'm also getting old. I'm so old I have my jab this week. So I think the rest, I think she was probably talking about Sheldon, who I know is in fantastic shape. Let me come to your question, Ghela. Rather than answer it in a very banal and general way, let me give you a specific example, which I think is kind of an interesting one. So we have had pretty recently within the PRA a kind of internal smash hit with the launch of something called Squirro, which is a cognitive search tool. I think of it as a kind of internal Google with some analytics for supervisors, and it has been an extremely popular, I always call it a squirrel because it amuses me to refer in that way. It may not amuse the rest of you, it does amuse me. It's been really popular on the front line, and we could have stopped there. But in fact, in that case, we've done exactly what you were just asking about, which is not because it advances our objectives in a very direct way, but because it seems a useful thing to do. We hosted a virtual event with regulators from around the world to demonstrate that tool. And the team is also doing more things like that, and we'll be showcasing it a bit at conferences and things of that kind. All, of course, subject to the confidentiality of the data that we're actually using the tool for. But that's just an example of where 98% of the effort had been made to deliver something for the team internally. And just by another 2% of effort, I think we can do a bit of what you're talking about.
Thanks, Sam. I'm going to stick with you for just a second. What were some of the lessons that came out of the Squirrel project that you can see be lifted, shifted, and put into place for other projects or for increasing the speed of adoption internally at the PRA?
Well, we've gone about this whole area from two different ends of the telescope, if you like. So at the end we were just talking about, I think of this as kind of a guerrilla action by our teams internally, trying to come up with stuff pretty quickly, give it out to the teams, subject to a bit of testing. And in that space, I say, things succeed or fail on how good they are. So either the supervisors like it and run with it as they are with this one, or actually it turns out not to add very much, it's not that great, in which case it can just fade away. And I think that's completely appropriate. And I think we should sort of have a survival of the fittest type approach at that end of the telescope. The other end of the telescope is in a completely different place, which is about how we approach the adoption of new technologies by firms in the market overall, which obviously you were touching on, as was Sian and the report quite significantly. And in that space, I think we have to proceed in a much more kind of measured way. Measured is not a sort of code word for slow and bureaucratic. I do mean measured. Some people would have been wondering. And just to give you one example, you've had an absolute bow wave of cloud adoption by firms in the recent period. Indeed, it seems to have been accelerated by COVID. And one of my EU colleagues described it as, it's become like electricity, is what they said, which I thought was quite an interesting way to put it. And we've always recognized that there are significant benefits of cloud adoption, just to pick that one example. And indeed, it's quite often, though not universally, been our experience that it's better from a cyber perspective. But there are risks too. And in particular, there are concentration risks. And the last point I'd make on this is that when you think about that from our perspective, you look at it from the PRA's perspective, we've got 1,300 people, we oversee 1,500 firms. Sheldon's got about twice as many people, but about 10 times as many firms. It is completely impractical to imagine that alongside everything else we've got to do, we are going to have a perfectly detailed and intimate knowledge of all of the workings of all firms' technology stacks. It's just not a runner as an idea. That's why our operational resilience policy focuses on the front end. What are the key business services that you deliver as a firm? What amount of downtime should we be prepared to tolerate when things go wrong? And how have you tested and proved that in quite bad stresses, you can actually meet that downtime? And I think it's important we hang on to that. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. I mean, there is that requirement to balance evolving to be able to consume the data that is produced and the information that is coming from the firms that you supervise. At the same time, it's actually doing the job. So I understand there's this digital transformation or digital adoption that has to be a roadmap that has to be put in place. But again, you have to do the day job. So I understand the balance. I think there's something about a public stance of saying we are going to be tech forward and looking at how we can also keep up with the evolution of the firms that we are supervising or regulating. And that leads me to ask a question of Sheldon. It's quite well known that the FCA is incredibly advanced in context of other regulators across the globe, especially in terms of turning to RegTech. I think the RegTech team was one of the first ever to be established, and that was at the FCA. So from a regulatory perspective, you're still maintaining the day-to-day work of managing all of the firms in the UK market. At the same time, there's also this interesting play of looking at digital innovation and adoption of RegTech and putting that forward. So can you give me an idea of where the FCA is in context of the future ambitions to promote not only RegTech, but tech adoption across the board?
Look, we are, I'd say we're super ambitious around data and around RegTech. And there's a few reasons for that. And some of it goes to, and I don't feel that in shape, Sam, and I have had my vaccine. But I was at the gym yesterday for the first time in quite a long time. So we really are enthusiastic about RegTech and the use of data. And I think one of the reasons it does go to what Sam just said. I think we've got sort of like 60,000 firms which are authorized by us. And Sam's right, there is no way in which we can person mark each and every firm and understand what they're doing with data, understand what technology they're employing, etc. So we work and regulate by a system of principles, standards, and expect firms to adopt and follow those. And when they don't, we enforce against those. Beyond that, though, I think we do have an opportunity to support in an appropriately agnostic way, and we can come on and debate agnosticism in this context shortly. But we do have an opportunity and perhaps even an obligation to ensure that the new possibilities to tackle some of the regulatory challenges that we have and some of the compliance challenges that firms have in complying with our rules, where data and technology can solve those. I think it's important for us to be part of that debate, part of ensuring that those solutions come forward. We can't do everything there. And I think one of the great things about what Sian was talking about in the report was getting the RegTech industry itself to set up, motivate, explain what it can do, sell itself effectively and how it can tackle those problems. But to give an idea of where we think RegTech is important, we think improving compliance, we think it's very important. You can really assist market participants and firms to detect financial crime and money laundering, report regulatory data, manage risk, and onboarding of customers. So improving compliance is very good. It then in turn can reduce the burden of compliance on firms. So once you use data, once you streamline in a safe and effective way, you start processing and automating tasks. And RegTech can really allow institutions, small and large actually, in some ways the opportunities for small firms to come in, set up and have the best future models for compliance. If we can get there, that could be a good thing. So they can invest in that automation. And then that frees up, I think, time capacity to invest in what we want is the best products and services out there for ultimately for customers. I think the third thing is sort of, and why I think at the FCA we've been interested in it, is what can RegTech do for us? So there's that external piece. Please use RegTech, please engage with these vendors and see what things they can solve for you in terms of your compliance activity. But then there's an internal piece for me, which is, well, we have a challenge of regulating firms. So the sweet spot would be that there are solutions out there that we understand, that we can capture data, capture information, get the right types of regulatory returns. And then that in turn makes not my job easier, but makes it more meaningful and more impactful in terms of its regulation. So I do think there's, I wouldn't call it a virtuous circle, but there's common incentives in a sense from having a RegTech industry develop and start to tackle some of the shared challenges and problems that I as a regulator have and the regulatees, the firms have too. So we're really supportive. And we've played several roles. I think we've been one of the leaders in terms of highlighting RegTech, which is kind of like a part of FinTech. And the reason why I think it's distinct from FinTech is because when you think about FinTech, you just think about people coming in and smashing things up and disruption and having fun. And that's great. This is disruption, but disruption and innovation. Oh, apologies, the lights have gone. I'm back in the office, the lights have gone out. Disruption and innovation with a focus on our regulatory challenges. And we've done tech sprints to bring people together, and we'll continue to do that sort of stuff. I can talk about the digital sandbox. We did a great tech sprint just last month, the Women's Economic Empowerment Tech Sprint, which you know about, Ghela. I mean, just like, bringing people together, I think, and using our convening powers to bring this industry together can be a real help to bring like-minded people together and to just make those connections and solve those problems together. So we are very positive. We'll continue in this space. But I think Sam is right about the note of caution. A regulator can't create a commercial market, and it can't tackle these problems. So yeah, I can create some conditions for that. I can encourage that, but it's up to the market. It's up to the firms to go out and make that happen. And I think this report is almost a call to arms for everybody to go out and make that happen. I'm going to go and switch the lights on.
All right. Well, thank you, Sheldon, for that perspective. We'll come back to you, for further discussion, of course. But something that you mentioned actually coincides with one of the questions that's been submitted by Jane G in the context of document meaning data. So let me give you the question. Do you agree that regulation needs to be amended to embrace digital solutions so that in some cases document can mean data? Now, I turn to Adriana because this actually addresses the documentation of the digital regulatory reporting, but it's in the context of data. And since data is not the new oil, thank you very much, but it is something that keeps the machines running. Adriana, talk to us a little bit about the industry and regulator collaboration that you've participated in, specifically around, and I think it's actually one of the first collaborative projects in the world between the PRA and Bank of England and industry around the digital regulatory reporting in context of document translating into data. Give us an idea of how that looks from an institution's perspective, and also at the same time, what sort of challenges did you face internally to get support and sponsorship to go digital in context of this?
Thanks, Ghela, thanks everybody, and for this for the report and for the ability to have this conversation with all of you. I just wanted to just address a couple of things that Sam and Sheldon had mentioned earlier, if that's okay, and talking about the fact that they couldn't be, obviously with all of the other responsibilities, responsible for the stacks that we have, the technology stacks that we have internally. And I don't think that that's something, I don't think that's what was being discussed. I think it was more about the fact that the world is sort of looking at the regulators for guidance, the world, our world of financial services. And that's, for instance, this week, the European Investment Bank came out publicly saying that they were planning on issuing and settling a digital Eurobond on the blockchain. And I think that will be a huge fire lit under the industry. It's like if the European Investment Bank is planning on doing something like that, that means it's okay for us to start looking at it and doing it. And I think that's the kind of thing. It's about talking about it publicly. I know years ago I talked to the FCA, and they were already doing things in the cloud, but it wasn't really very public. And the industry was still sitting back saying, oh, we don't know if we should use a cloud. We don't know if it's safe. And it's, I think a lot of it is just saying, look, we're doing it. We think it's okay. We're not saying that, we're responsible for what you do or telling you how to do it. And I think two of the things we talk about is neutrality and agnostic. And I think tech neutrality is how it should be, because, the legislation shouldn't be based on the technology, but it shouldn't be agnostic. It should be, yes, you should be using this. And I think when you look at, the report, it says 32.1% of the overall RegTech usage was in financial crime. And I think a lot of that is the fines are very high. It's, we have to move away from the fact that we're actually only stopping 1% of, money laundering, and actually get that. And also, the FCA has been involved in the last couple of years, or the last few years, in these huge tech sprints, one with the U.S. Treasury, and doing cross-border collaboration and bringing out RegTech solutions for the industry to view. So I think that's interesting. For me, you guys know how I feel. I mean, the FCA has been far and beyond any other regulator globally, and then the Bank of England and PRA are in there as well in highlighting how industry can work together with regulators. It's a first collaboration between 3 regulators and 6 industry participants, and then bringing the RegTechs in and out on a solution that we all needed to work towards. And, and you asked how I dealt with that internally. It was a little bit like herding cats, trying to get, the resources and the time from people. We're already stretched as it is with all the things we need to comply with. But my point was always, there is no competitive advantage on the compliance side. This is something that we should work together as the industry, and we should not be building our own individual little silos of how to deal with it. Let's come up with a solution together. However, as much as I wanted that, if the FCA and the Bank of England and the PRA had not been sitting at that table, it would have been impossible to do. They had skin in the game, so then I could go to management and say, look, they're serious about this. This isn't just us sitting around, the industry saying, this is nice, let's work on it, and then at the end of it, nothing happens. They were involved from day one, and they weren't saying you have to do it this way. It was very much from the beginning, we don't know what we don't know. Let's work on this together. When I brought my senior management into some of the, the open days at the end of, because there were a few different sprints over the last few years and work we were doing, they couldn't understand how this would work. And when they went, they were so in awe of the fact that they had absolutely no idea of who worked for who or what, none of that. Because it didn't make any difference. We were working as an industry together. So I think that was such a fantastic example for, for the community, for the rest of the world. And I realize that you can't do that with everything, but it's that sort of collaboration that needs to happen, unfortunately, for us to be able to put those type of resources in. And just looking at, the future sort of with the fin crime, which makes sense, but I think the next one that is again, it's that thing is what's a must-have? And ESG is a must-have, because we cannot fulfill our requirements or mine that data or do anything with the information if we don't use RegTech solutions, if we don't find a way to consolidate that information. So I think that will be the next growth area. And the DRR, it's on its way. I've been proud sort of flag bearer for this thing from the beginning. And it's, I will just say, with the regulator sitting at the table, it's made it easy.
Thank you for that perspective. I think to get the RegTech side of the point of view, I'd like to ask Joanne to jump in here, because you're looking at having built two companies. They focus on the compliance mandates, and you've had to build these from scratch. At the same time, you're trying to increase adoption, and you're trying to almost create a standard. And Adriana sort of mentioned this, that this compliance is not a competitive space. There is no competitive advantage to do things differently when you can actually orchestrate and harmonize and have similar standards across the board. And in building your companies, you've actually, I think, looked to do that, is increase transparency, have a particular standard in transparency and reporting, and it's outcome oriented, it's principles based, and that it's the protecting of the end customer and ensuring that the institution itself is able to comply to regulatory requirements. Give us an idea of how you looked at building companies and how you're looking at working not only with regulators, but with industry to increase adoption and help standardize the way they approach not only reporting, but any other compliance matters. Give us an idea of how you see that and how you see RegTech as a particular vertical. If they can manage to do that collaboratively, what kind of growth we can expect for RegTech over the coming years in terms of adoption and talent acquisition, as well as finance and investment attraction.
Thanks, Ghela. I'm an ex-regulator, so everything that I do, it looks at the business problem to try and to solve for it. When we created Recordshare, which is effectively the ability to use AI not to effectively do compliance without human touching of compliance, we did it for a very particular purpose. We saw a gap in the market and did it. However, starting a RegTech business sort of 8 years ago it's been interesting, because if I look at the RegTech community, we're mostly startups, some scale-ups, but 66% of the UK RegTechs are less than 50 people, which it's almost like a perfect storm, because they're solving a very difficult business problem for the banks and larger organizations. They're solving this issue of trust and working around with sensitive data to be able to fix a problem that they perceive. But if you're less than 50 people, a startup, your challenge is you're working on the solution. You're not working on the outward go-to-market propositions for your business, which Sheldon mentioned about how, and in fact Sian mentioned earlier, around how do you promote your businesses. So we have a little bit of a perfect storm about there's less than 5% of RegTechs that are over 500 people. So those smaller startups have got to keep innovating. We've got to keep trying, and the regulators have got to make it easier for us to keep doing that. And I think I agree with Adriana. Particularly the FCA have been instrumental in the RegTech growth across the UK and across the globe, and I've been really impressed with that. In fact, working with them recently, they've introduced ethical hacking, which I think is amazing for loads of reasons. I think it's amazing, but I think it's amazing because when we work with banks, we go into a procurement cycle and then we go into information security, and you can imagine how long that takes. It takes about anything between 18 months to 2 years to get a bank on as a client. When you've got a different approach where the regulators are saying, well, we're going to go and we're going to break your systems, we're going to see how good you are, and we're going to do it rather quickly, that just takes away all the pain for an organization. So I really like that idea that even the regulators are challenging us. We're challenging the firms, the organizations, the banks, but the regulators are challenging us to find different solutions to our products and services. So I'm hugely excited about the RegTech industry, and I think that this report has highlighted some of the challenges that we have within the industry. But we do need that stronger voice. We do need that support mechanism, and we do need to be able to work with large and small organisations. Sheldon mentioned 60,000 organisations for FCA under the FCA's remit, and not all of them are large organisations, and not all of them will have the ability to do the thing that Adriana mentioned about having dialogue with the PRA or FCA. There'll be lots of small organisations that have still customers at the heart of their business, and they'll still be creating risks for the FCA. So let's try and solve this as an industry-wide solution. So there's lots of things we can do, and I remain excited about the RegTech challenge. I'd like more funding into it. I'd like more support for the RegTechs, because if you're under 50 people, then you have all the challenges that, you know, around strength and where do you put your dollars effectively. So I'd like more support in that, but we've got to keep innovating. It's still important. We've got lots of things to fix, but if we can do it by using technology, then I'm all for it.
Joanne, there's also a question that's sort of come through chat that relates to this. There are different customers for the RegTech vertical. It's not just the regulators and it's not just the institutions. It's a number of, when you think about 60,000 firms, not all of them are financial firms. A lot of them are fintech that also require RegTech solutions in terms of their reporting. So how does a firm, or collectively, how does RegTech actually start to articulate the value propositions for the various customers? And really, how do they target the various customers and have a collective sort of syntax and language to relay the value propositions and also sort of further that message? Because maybe it is an awareness thing, but it's also, how do you articulate the value of compliance and good governance? I mean, I think it seems obvious, but clearly the take-up requires a bit more refinement of that message.
Well, I mean, the report breaks down the RegTechs into the key component areas, and I think financial crime and AML is so well understood and is so well progressed in the RegTech field, but the others perhaps not so. And I wonder if there's some merging and collaboration that can be done between each of the different cohorts of RegTechs to be able to bring that voice to the fore, because it's the first time I've seen the split between the different RegTechs, and I think we can do more around that and actually try to bring the rest of the RegTech community up to the AML, KYC areas of adoption by sort of collaborating together in the different sectors or the different cohorts of RegTech. That would be a great start of 10.
Taking that view that Joanne just expressed, Adriana, give us an idea of some of the challenges to sell internally to stakeholders across the organization and various divisions, and what sort of tools would you better be armed with from the RegTech community in order to sell internally and to ensure that they have a route to adoption?
So something that I often, when I speak at conferences on RegTech, that I bring up is that oftentimes the solutions will be a solution for one small problem of a regulation. We'll address that, and that's incredibly difficult to sell. You know, again, with stretched resources and funding and things that are a nice to have, they're considered, not a must have. So, you know, what I ask is, can you find can the solutions be leveraged across the firm? If you really understand sort of the makeup of the firm that you're going to, the institution, and then how can that be leveraged? Is it is it something that could be used for data, but not just for MiFID or EMEA or, you know, some of the other regulations, SFTR, but something across the board? Is it something that's scalable? Is it something that if you're not around in 2 years that we still own and that we can then use internally, and there isn't that concern that you're not going to be there tomorrow to help us with it? Because I think that's one of the issues that we have with it. And then it was interesting because I was speaking at a UK finance panel on RegTech, and there was a lady from a RegTech there, and I said, you know, one of the issues is the legacy systems that we have, and how do we integrate that? And it's sort of a little bit of Scotch tape. And she said, no, the solution that we have actually lays on top of your legacy system, and it isn't a problem. It is like a plug and play, which is something else, you know, that I think would be fantastic. Is what about the RegTechs getting together and doing an end-to-end solution with different, you know, solutions that could work together that are interoperable, you know, things like that. So, but how do you? There has to be some central body that can do this, and obviously that's not the place of the regulators, but some organization, some institution that would work on this together. And I know, you know, we had done through the DRR, we spent a lot of time with Shruti at Fuse you know, had that legal tech sort of accelerator. And, you know, we talked about that. It would be great if you could, through this, say to the different legal tech institutions, you know, it's the same technologies, right, just applied to different problems, to work together to find end-to-end solutions that then the institutions can kind of go almost like Lego and pick up and say, you know, these are the bits we need and we can lay these internally. But that interoperability and standardization, I think, is incredibly important, and some place where all of this is being convened and organized so that it's easy for the institutions and the regulators to sort of dip in and out.
Thank you. I think we've got just a couple minutes left, and unfortunately this is such a rich report to try to unpack all of the questions that it prompts. Impossible to do in such a short time frame. I want to ask Sheldon and Sam what they see as the most proactive step the regulators can take to encourage more digitization in the context of being able to meet regulatory requirements, but also the future, you know, what they're looking towards in the immediate future, and how some of their upcoming activities will prep the ground for better RegTech adoption. And I want to leave those last two perspectives with the community. I think it gives us an idea of how we start shaping the communication, how we start approaching selling up into institutions, and also starting to partner with other RegTech firms to sort of piece an entire end-to-end solution together. And it also sort of indicates where we're going in terms of tech sprint and innovation and multi-regulator and multi-industry player cross-border collaboration, and especially with the showcasing of what's possible that the technology firms are providing. So Sam and Sheldon, one final quip around your attitude and your institution's attitude and sort of the future of technology adoption internally and externally for the market. I'll leave you with the final word.
Great, thanks, Ghela. Why don't I go briefly and then I'll pass to Sheldon. Been a really interesting discussion, and I think it is touched on. There's a fault line here for the regulators. There's a stance that we should have, and then there's a stance which probably we shouldn't have. And my perspective on that is that we should absolutely be open-minded to new ways of doing things. We should be removing unnecessary obstacles. We should, as Sheldon said, be ambitious, and we should create the right conditions. As you said, Ghela, tech forward. I think all of those are good. I think we have to be careful, though, about, and this I think was really a point Sheldon was making, going to the next stage where we are a kind of advocate ourselves of specific forms of regulatory change. Now, sometimes, of course, we will be. If firms have IT that just isn't working, and it's obvious that they could do it better or cheaper, of course, it's part of our job to point them and say, well, haven't you noticed that a lot of other people are doing it much better than you now, or there are other opportunities. But I think we shouldn't go too much beyond that, because a technological shift that is led by a small number of people in the public sector making choices does not strike me as necessarily a good technological shift. So I think we should be about creating right conditions, creating the right mood, showing that we're open to things and not being a barrier and being encouraging. But I myself would draw the line one step short of even tech neutral advocation, because I just don't think that's the role of the regulator. I'll pass to Sheldon.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with all of what Sam said there. I mean, I think in terms of what the FCA will be doing, we will be, continuing to work with industry to work through what RegTech can do to solve and tackle some of the challenges in that neutral way. And I think, the way that Anne-Adriana described events where you collaborate and you don't know who's who, in a sense is neutral. It's about the outcome that we're seeking to achieve and the challenges that we're seeking to solve in that room. And then outside of that room, of course, you start to do business and you start to work out who can pair up with who to solve those challenges. That's fine. But we can convene those settings and we'll create those conditions. We'll be continuing with the great digital sandbox pilot we're doing with Catherine and colleagues at the City of London Corporation, and that's going well, and I'm sure we'll be expanding that, so we'll still be in the space there, and I'm sure we'll have future tech sprints. There's a question on global. We're still working with GFIN, and a lot of the work there is to sort of dig into how we can collaborate cross-jurisdictionally on things like regulatory reporting, on things like supervisory technology, so how we have the right sort of technology as supervisors. So all of that work we will still be committed to and moving forward. But I think, as Sam said, I mean, I'm kind of urging this report to see an emergence of an industry out there which holds its own and has confidence, integrity, and to the extent that we can support that, we will. But supporting individual firms or individual technologies is not necessarily where we're at. And I just note in the sidebar in the questions, Michael Nichols has mentioned the great work that they're seeing with RegTech vendors out there working with partners. We also, from our supervisory activity, see lots of activity out there, particularly with the major firms, but also some small firms. This industry is alive and it's moving forward, and we're happy to play our part in that and really positive about how it is moving forward.
Thank you,
Can I say one thing, Ghela? Can I just say one thing that I wanted to say earlier, which is it says a lot that a 72-page report, which was the last copy that I had without the acknowledgements, is actually interesting on RegTech. Would never think that you could have something you'd actually want to read. So that says a lot about this industry and the good work that Sean and team did.
We echo that sentiment. I mean, I did actually read all 72 pages that I was forwarded. So, and I did it in one sitting. I think to wrap this up, I think it's important to acknowledge that tech neutrality is one thing, but it's also the understanding of where the evolution of technology is going. And I want to leave you with one quick example. When PSD2 was written, it counted on screen scraping to collect data. It didn't actually foresee the use and adoption of APIs. And unfortunately, that oversight in terms of setting out the framework for potential tech evolution has actually caused the delivery of PSD2 to take a much longer route to fruition than it would have. So there is something about recognition of tech neutrality and being tech agnostic, but also understanding that the regulatory and legal framework needs to be able to evolve as the technology evolves itself. And the move from cloud to AI, to API, to all sorts of different things in terms of also cryptography. All of that has to be ingested and enabled from a regulatory landscape in order to satisfy this sort of immediate real-time supervision that this industry requires because it is entirely risk-based. And in order to achieve those operational efficiencies, we have to be tech positive. We can't be tech neutral. Even regulators are using it and adopting it. And I would say by inference, they're not tech neutral, they're actually tech positive. But a more coordinated approach. There are definitely challenges that have been identified in the report, but there are also recommendations that are positive solutions towards more RegTech adoption, further exploration of the possibility to satisfy the problems and challenges that arise as finance becomes much more sophisticated. I'd like to thank Sam and Sheldon and Adriana and Joanne for their contribution. Thank you, Sean and team, for putting this together. And Catherine, thank you for the opportunity to participate, and I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you very much, Ghela, and thank you to you for being such a brilliant facilitator for this panel session. And I think we've really benefited from your own background in innovation and in fintech bank collaboration. So thank you. And a very warm thank you to Sean and RegTech Associates for this report. You've heard it's a great read. Take it home and read it over the weekend. I'll read it today. And we really hope that it will act, as Sheldon said, as a call to action, and that the recommendations in it will help us to move forward in realising the potential of this of RegTech. So look, we look forward to working with all of you, our partners and our stakeholders, as we take the recommendations forward. Thank you very much for attending today, and I am sorry that we couldn't cover all the questions in the Q&A, but I think it just goes to show how much potential there is here, what a great report it is, and how we should all work on realising the recommendations and seeing this grow. Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend when you get to it. Thanks.
Thanks all.